This is Lovecraft's Untold Stories 2, of course a sequel to the original that was a very challenging game but a pretty interesting experiment in setting an action RPG like this deep within Lovecraft's mythos. This is a top-down action RPG that is sort of a roguelite and sort of isn't, we'll get onto that in a minute, but is most definitely just as challenging as the original, if not more so in certain aspects. It is a bit rougher on the edges in certain spots, which we'll talk about later, but for the most part I've actually had quite a bit of fun playing this game so far, so let's get into it. The first obvious thing to talk about is the art style. Just like the first game, it uses a really interesting art style that looks very, very good in my opinion. There's a ton of environmental detail in all the areas in this game, and the whole thing uses this sort of contrasting 1920s Weird Tales magazine sort of art style that looks really awesome. All of the environments themselves are very kind of desaturated, lots of grays and browns and dark greens and things like that, but all of the enemies are very bright and colorful, like bright purple tentacles and cultists wearing bright red robes and things like that. That makes them contrast very heavily with the environments and gives them this feeling of it shouldn't be here, which obviously in a Lovecraftian universe is exactly the point. So you have these really nicely detailed environments, from docks to asylums and cemeteries and all sorts of other things, including some underground areas that get a bit dream world-ish. So all the environments are this very dismal, dreary, New England Lovecraft country kind of thing that makes them look really good. But it's really cool how they contrast this with the enemies that look wildly out of place. So you've got all sorts of things, like of course the deep ones are here, various kinds of cultists, some of which have Tommy guns of course. The ghouls are here as well, naturally, and some much less human-like enemies that you'll face as well, especially the bosses, some of which are very visually impressive to look at, and are the kind of incomprehensible mass of eyes and tentacles that you would expect from a Lovecraft country like this. Gameplay-wise, you will choose between 6 different characters. The first 3 characters are the original 3 from the first game, and the other 3 you'll unlock later on in the second part of this game once you actually get to them. And each one has their own different types of equipment that they can find around the levels, their own different primary weapons, and in some cases secondary weapons, it depends on the character, as well as a suite of different abilities. Generally speaking, there's some sort of consumable ability like a grenade or an explosive bone to throw, although it again depends on the character, as well as some sort of utility skill that's either like a dodge, a teleport, a shield, a heal, some sort of utility like that. And oftentimes there's also some sort of escape, but it depends again on the character. They've done a pretty good job of diversifying them because every character plays very, very different from every other one, so you can switch whenever you want when you're back at the sort of hub area, which is the artist's mansion. And within the artist's mansion you have a storage box to store all of your various crafting materials, more on that in a second, as well as all sorts of other items that you just may want to put in the box for now, like different pieces of equipment for other characters that you're not currently playing, so they're not clogging up your inventory and stuff like that. You've also got a crafting bench for doing the actual crafting itself, as well as a different sort of portal to each of the characters' individual starting areas that you can do if you want to, just to help you get used to the characters, as well as get some crafting materials and things just to help you out. These are, as far as I can tell, optional missions that are mostly there to familiarize you with each person and can only be done once. Structure-wise, you have an overall main quest line that focuses on uncovering the mysteries behind the specific artist that you find, and you can actually switch between characters at will and play any of the levels with any of the characters you want, except for those particular characters' introductory levels. So you are encouraged to swap around depending on just playstyle preferences, as well as the general gear that you happen to have. You know, maybe you find a whole bunch of cool stuff for the veteran, you might switch to the veteran to see how he plays and see if you like all the stuff that you found and things of that nature. So you'll be going on a series of various missions in a linear order between the streets of the city that you're in, as well as all sorts of other important locations, from Arkham Asylum to various cemeteries and some underground bits that all represent different sort of mysterious locations where you're trying to uncover what's actually going on. Each of the levels are randomly generated, but they all do have a specific theme to them, of course, a different tile set for each area, from various dreary city streets to the craziest of the asylums. Each of the different tile sets are actually really well realized, and like I mentioned earlier, they're extremely detailed. All of the background detail, as well as the enemy and character models, all look very good in this super hand-drawn style that makes everything really pop out, again with that use of color and that use of sort of atmospheric effects like rain and things. It really adds a lot to the areas, and one really cool little feature is that pretty much everything that you can equip on your characters actually visually shows up on them, despite them being like hand-drawn. It does actually change their model, which is a really nice touch that I didn't expect. There are tons of lootable items in each of the areas, mostly crates and barrels and things of that nature, and sometimes, of course, the monsters themselves will also drop pieces of loot, and all of this loot is useful for crafting, and there's a whole bunch of different crafting materials. You can also, of course, find new bits of gear for any individual character. Sometimes you won't actually get gear for the character you're currently playing, but you can, of course, take it back to the mansion and store it for later use, and you'll also find lots of different blueprints around the place that will allow you to craft new gear as well as upgraded variants of gear you currently have, as well as certain other extremely rare items used for very specific recipes, and even some consumables. You'll simply go screen by screen, killing all the enemies on that screen in order to move on to the next one. It's actually a pretty simple setup, but it gets very, very challenging very quickly because enemies outnumber you a lot. They do a lot of damage, and you can't really take that much damage, so you have to really take advantage of the special features of the specific character you're playing, as well as conserve your consumables for their most opportune time to use them, because they're not that common. You won't be getting tons of healing or anything in this game, and crafting healing does take quite a bit of resources, so you won't be able to do it like dozens and dozens of times. Now, I did mention that this game is kind of a roguelite and kind of not, and that's because you don't actually reset your entire progress whenever you die. You only reset to the beginning of the mission that you're currently on. So you don't have to start the entire campaign over every time you die, and when you actually revive after you die, you start with everything that you had at that point. So whatever was in your inventory, whatever your character was equipped with, and all of your resources and things like that do stay when you die, but they're sort of like a snapshot of whatever you had at the start of that particular mission that you died on. Everything you picked up after that is lost. This does mean the only way to actually get more resources on a permanent basis is to survive a mission and bring them back to the mansion and put them in storage. This can create some problems sometimes where you feel you need some consumables to complete a mission, but you have to complete that mission in order to get the materials to craft the consumables that you need to complete the mission. So there are some instances where things get very, very difficult because you can't keep anything on death at all, except for what you started that mission with, but there is a bit of a solution to this in that there are tons of little stacks of newspapers that you can find around the main missions, and reading these will actually give you side quests to do. And this game, side quest is maybe a bit of a misnomer because you almost need these quests, actually. They're not part of the main quest line, but you're encouraged to do them because they are a better way to get a lot of resources to help you craft stuff and survive the main missions, because the main missions are a lot longer and more difficult, so doing these side missions is a shorter, more compact way to gather some resources and get yourself some new gear and stuff like that to actually tackle the harder missions later. So that's pretty much the main gameplay loop of the game. Choose your character, get some gear, craft some stuff, go on these tough missions and try and make it back with a better understanding of what's going on and some new stuff to craft, and occasionally dip into some side quests to help replenish your stores of materials and maybe even find some lucky blueprints. It's a pretty simple formula, but it pulls it off really well, mostly because it's dressed up in this mythos, and this game was very clearly made by people that absolutely love Lovecraft's mythos and know a lot about it. I've seen some references to things in this game that, like some stories and things that you just normally don't see references to, because of course there's the obvious stuff like Cthulhu and stuff like the deep ones, those are here, but there's also some much more obscure stuff that you don't normally see people talk about all that much when they're talking about this universe. You've got references to stuff like Herbert West Reanimator. I've seen something that reminded me of The Dreams in the Witch House, as well as a scene that looked like it was drawn straight out of The Thing on the Doorstep. And there's, of course, also some references to entities that weren't purely Lovecraft creations and were sort of expanded universe bits of the mythos. So you're looking at some other things like Tsathoggua and some of the other weirder forms of Nyarlathotep that came later and some of those other really crazy stuff. And it shows that the people that are making this know a lot about the mythos and wanted to dress the whole game up in a very detailed, very deeply atmospheric version of it, so that like everything is a reference to some story or some bit of mythos lore. And if you've read a lot of these stories and you're very familiar with this universe, you feel right at home in this game because you see everything and everything makes sense, and it shows that they care a lot about this world to make a game that is this detailed in that world. But I did mention that it can be a bit rough around the edges, so I do have a couple of problems with it that I'd like to say, because the devs are usually very responsive to actually fixing things and changing things, so I definitely have a small list of stuff that I think might need addressing. For one, the game's difficulty. Now, normally I don't like to complain about the difficulty of a game on this channel, because chances are I just suck and need to get better, and there's nothing actually wrong with it. But this is one case where I actually do feel justified in saying that there are some things I think might be a bit overtuned. Namely, the Status effects. There are 4 different damage over time status effects in this game that I've seen: bleed, burn, acid, and poison, and they all last for an extremely long time. You can have all of them on you at once, and they all do tons of damage. This means that there are some characters, like the Witch and the Medium, the very squishy characters, that can actually die in one hit in this game, because a lot of the enemies, like the vast majority of the enemies, can inflict at least one of these status effects on you, some of them multiple status effects, and the damage is very high. So if someone like the Witch gets smacked by something that poisons her, combined with the poison dot and the damage the initial attack did, basically she's dead. So if you're playing one of the more squishy characters, if you even get hit a single time, you may as well restart your run because you're going to die. And I think that's a little bit excessive for these status effects to last so long that they're basically an immediate death sentence after just one hit every single time. Not only that, but they're not a chance to be inflicted with them, they are a 100% chance. If an enemy can inflict one of these, they always will every time they hit you. I understand that the game is supposed to be challenging, and for the most part the challenge actually feels pretty good, but I do think that some parts of it, like these status effects and the overall ability for enemies to swarm you in a way that you couldn't have avoided, is maybe a bit too punishing. Apparently every enemy with a ranged attack in this game went to the Navy SEAL Marksmanship Academy because they never ever miss, and they can fire projectiles that are way faster than you can dodge, and with like just flawless accuracy every single time, and it makes fighting ranged enemies a complete nightmare because it feels like you can't avoid their damage. Like, the second a single pixel of your hitbox peeks out from cover, they'll hit you with like a laser accurate shot every single time. So I do think that maybe some of that needs to be toned down a little bit, and honestly I think that reducing some of that stuff wouldn't even make the game easier, it would just make it feel more fair, because there's a difference between challenge, something you can overcome, and just raw, unrefined difficulty. And I feel that basically making it to where if you get hit a single time you die no matter what, that's just raw difficulty and isn't actually challenging, it's just kind of annoying. And I think that some of this stuff could maybe be toned down just a little bit, and it wouldn't really even affect the overall challenge level of the game. I also feel that there's way too much clutter in the maps. Now, don't get me wrong, it gives them a very lived-in feel and makes them look nice visually, but mechanically, it's really easy to constantly get stuck on all of the stuff around because there's just so much stuff on the ground. And a lot of my deaths were enemies pushing me into inescapable areas and then mobbing me and killing me instantly in a way that I never could have even avoided because I was stuck on geometry. There's just too much stuff. Sometimes there's so much clutter on the ground that the enemies can't even reach you because their pathfinding breaks, and they don't know how to get to you. This also causes problems with looting, because after every single time you finish a room, you're supposed to spend like 10 minutes going around opening 24 boxes to get some loot, and it really grinds the pace of the game to a halt when every single time you finish a room you gotta spend a long time searching for all these crates and stuff, because you need these resources, but it's all spread throughout the whole map, and just a ton of these little crates everywhere, and I feel that there's just too many of them, and it's just meaningless busy work at that point. You know, I would rather have a smaller number of crates to open with more meaningful amounts of loot in each. So instead of giving me 10 crates to open with $4 in each, maybe give me 2 crates to open with $20 in each. That would create a lot less clutter on the ground, but it would still give me the same amount of resources and would feel like less busy work. I think it would also be kind of nice if we could have some slots every time we died to keep a couple of things in our inventory. Obviously most of our stuff would disappear, but sometimes you can get stuck in those cycles where you die because you don't have enough resources to survive, so you lose all your resources and can't survive the next time either. And it can be a vicious circle, so it would be nice if you could maybe have, say, 3 slots where you could choose 3 of your inventory slots to keep, and they would automatically be sent to the mansion storage. This way you could slowly build up some resources, maybe keep a good piece of gear that you found and things like that. Just select a couple of things out of your inventory to keep every time so that it didn't quite feel like you were completely resetting back to 0 every single time. And then there's the character balance. I think for the most part the characters are quite well balanced and nicely diversified and fun to play, but there is one example of one that I think is just way too weak. So you have 2 different glass cannon characters. You have the Medium and the Witch, and the Medium is really fun to play. She has a nice escape, she can turn invisible and float through stuff, she has pretty powerful weapons that you can use, like usually handguns and revolvers and the like, and she can summon the Ghost Mafia, which is really useful and a lot of fun to do. So she's actually a really fun character, but the Witch, however, is not. I feel that she is way too weak in her current state and needs to be buffed, because she's a glass cannon that doesn't do any damage, which doesn't make any sense. She's like way behind the curve of everyone else, even with better weapons, in terms of damage, and that's the opposite of what a glass cannon character should be, right? She should be ahead of the curve in damage, but behind the curve in survivability, but as it stands right now, she just feels behind in everything. Not to mention the spell that she has on the right mouse button is actually kind of useless, because it is a channeled AoE lightning attack around her, which sounds nice, except it has like melee range. It only hits enemies that are like right up in your face, which if you're a glass cannon character is not what you want. It also forces you to stand still for a couple of seconds while you channel it, which means you're basically going to die if you use it with very many enemies on screen, and it also does very little damage. So if you do manage to cast it, the payoff isn't even very good. So this is what I mean. I just think the witch is overall too weak in general, and could use maybe a bit of an update in terms of her kit to make her more competitive with the other characters. But luckily, I haven't ran into any like major game-breaking bugs or anything like that, except for, I will say there is one, the Exciter weapon for the Alienist does no damage, as in it does no damage to anything. I even brought it to a boss fight so I could check the health gauge of the boss and see how much damage it was actually doing, and it does nothing. So that needs to be fixed. But like I said, for the most part, the issues I have with this game are just sort of balance and relative difficulty issues, things that can be smoothed out if other people end up agreeing with me and the developers start to think that maybe some of the stuff needs to change. Obviously, I don't want just my voice to be the only one that says these things. The developers themselves would have to actually agree that there might be a problem here, so we'll see how that works when the game launches, but I do think that with these relatively minor things out of the way, it'll be a really enjoyable game that is set in a really cool version of this mythos that they've done a very good job of realizing. So you'll be able to try this game out yourself tomorrow at the time that this video goes up, Tuesday the 13th of September. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.